When we take the meditation posture, we're developing a posture and an attitude of attentive openness to whatever arises. And this is actually a very brave thing to do. I think maybe we wouldn't actually even begin on this journey if we knew how brave that is. To just sit and open our minds, open our whole being with attentive openness to whatever might arise. Because in so doing, we are actually opening ourselves beyond our usual, habitual view of ourself and of reality. We actually don't know what we're going to see. And one of the first things that one gradually begins to perceive is that perhaps we aren't quite who we thought we were. And sometimes that's quite embarrassing, because maybe we thought we were kind, and we see that we have a lot of aggressive and downright mean thoughts. Maybe we thought that we were quite a spiritual person, perhaps, and we find that we obsess for hours about all the things we want and crave and desire, and things that would make us feel so good, and sex and food and everything. In any case, what I'm getting at is that we sit and we just look with openness, as much openness as we can. And in so doing, we're opening ourselves to letting go, or seeing through, or at least seeing exactly who we are and what we do. We're setting ourselves up, you could say, for some of the ways, and eventually all of the ways, in which we conventionally and habitually view reality, to let those fall apart. So it's very brave. And this path is considered the path of the brave ones, which doesn't mean we are brave, but it means that we begin to cultivate our fearlessness, cultivate our wish to move from narrow to open, to move from holding on to things very rigidly to a more flexible, adaptable, open stance way of looking at things. What happens on the journey, which many of us in this room have already experienced, you may have even experienced it today, is that every once in a while you completely come to your edge. You come to the place where you know you're about to make a step into what is as yet not quite known to you. You're just about to sort of step over the edge. This happens again and again on the spiritual journey, that we meet this place of just going a little further than we ever have before in terms of how we perceive reality. It's basically going from being so dedicated and so habitually committed to a static way of perceiving and thinking to a fluid, open way of perceiving and thinking. But when we come to that edge, it brings up all of our fear. Part of the spiritual journey is coming to know the nature of fear, because you can't just move from a very narrow and rigid way of perceiving and thinking into an open way of thinking. You can't just drop all of those old comforting conditionings and concepts without it being accompanied by some fear and trembling. So I said that the journey is one from narrowness to openness. You could also say it's a journey of moving from fear to fearlessness, or from a gradual process of becoming less and less afraid. In case you think there's something wrong with feeling fear, You should know that the definition of a fully enlightened being is one who is completely fearless. So it's a huge accomplishment to be completely fearless. As we travel on the path, we get to know fear. We get to know the nature of fear. And gradually we become much more adaptable and much more able to stay open and attentive to whatever might arise. Another definition of a fully awakened person is someone who stays open to their emotions and thoughts and people and anything that might arise without centralizing into a self or centralizing back into themselves, just reaching out, opening out. So we move in that direction, but we don't have any big expectations of what time of day or what month or year we're supposed to arrive. In fact, as they say, the path is the goal. Step by step, each step, that's all there is. There actually never is any future point. There's just now and how you relate to right now. Because fear is inevitable in this process of growing up and of surrendering and of letting go of old, crippling ways of perceiving and thinking, it's essential that from the very beginning we develop trust and inner strength. So the question comes, where do we look? When we are afraid, when we feel that we can't handle what's happening, where do we look for strength? And in what do we place our trust? So first I'd like to give a very succinct, and I have always found quite useful teaching on looking in the wrong places. The story of our life. The personal autobiography of everybody in the room. And this is the teaching on the three lords of materialism. If you want to read more about this, you can read in the introduction to Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He writes about this. So the three lords of materialism are the Lord of form, the Lord of speech, and the Lord of mind. And there's somewhat a description of when the going gets rough, what we usually cling to. And in fact, they're a description of what we cling to even when the going isn't rough. Kind of a description of ego, a description of how ego is just a lot of habits. You know, I was thinking today that a good description of ego is just addiction. And the reason that there's fear, as we're sort of seeing through the patterns and habits of this addiction, the same reason we experience fear when we set out to give up any addiction. We have received so much security from this addiction, and the letting go of it, which we know is going to bring actually much more lasting happiness and freedom, is extremely uncomfortable. So the Lord of form, this is saying how we look to things of all kinds, for security and comfort. How we look to things for strength, and we put our trust in things. So at the level of common addictions, that's like saying when we feel anxious, and so we reach for a drink, or we smoke dope, or take other drugs, or we eat. And all of us have our cravings and addictions. Some are more crippling and damaging to ourselves and others, but we all have them. Things that if we actually can't do them, we feel extremely anxious and like we're going to die if we can't have that piece of chocolate. You can actually create these addictions really easily, You just every night have a warm bath, and then one night you say, tonight I'm not going to have one, and you freak out. So we put a lot of energy into reaching out and grasping at things. And the thing is that actually when we think of it, a lot of these things we already know that there's a hangover and that it doesn't bring any kind of happiness. In fact, it weakens us. We already know that. Nevertheless, one can't underestimate the power of these feelings, and therefore one can't underestimate the kind of bravery it takes to begin to turn these habits and patterns that we call ego, to turn them around. We actually, even though we are quite an intelligent species, on the charts of the evolution of consciousness, we're pretty high up there. And some of us are even called geniuses, and brilliant people. But I think really we're pretty stupid. When it really comes down to it, we all have these habits that we look to things outside of ourselves. We look for strength in what weakens us. And in a lot of cases, these things that we reach for are very tied up with our identity of who we are, how we hold ourselves together. So maybe what we reach for is nature, and we have this image of ourselves as one who loves solitude and nature and goes off into the wilderness in their kayak. Well, personally, I'm one of those people. I like to do that kind of thing. So it's not putting down any of these things, but more to say that we use them to comfort ourselves. We use them to try to avoid just being present in the moment. They somehow are a concept or an image or an ideal that's between us and the direct experience of reality. We have an image of ourselves as a creative person or a scholar, but some sense of seeking, holding on, grasping at things. And even though we may think we ourselves, personally, we are not materialistic, nevertheless, I think most of us know what it's like, that good feeling of buying something new. The Lord of speech is how we use our beliefs to limit ourselves or weaken ourselves or use our beliefs. I think when Trungpa Rinpoche is talking about this in talk, he talks about them all as looking for alternatives to just being right where we are with a clear, direct experience of reality. So this goes for all the isms, political beliefs, religions, all of these things. It definitely can go for Buddhism, meditation, any kind of belief system. We may not think it's dogma. We may think it's like a very liberated belief system. But nevertheless, it's so tied up with our identity and so colors our view of the world. And it actually doesn't bring any lasting happiness. For instance, when people come into the Buddhist teachings, this is something I'm very familiar with from my personal experience and through working and talking with a lot of people. Often people come in with such passion and enthusiasm, joining a new group and a new way of looking, and they just eat up the teachings. And then you hear them having arguments with people who don't believe in the truth of suffering. In other words, it becomes something else that you go to battle for. We see this in the ecology movement, that it's such a worthy thing. And yet we see a lot of kind of dogmatic warfare. And I remember in the early 60s, I lived in Berkeley, and the free speech movement, we had a guy living in our basement who was very involved. Basically, as soon as it looked like the conflict was going to get resolved, he would go into a deep depression. And then there was some kind of elation that would come over him when a new cause could arise. So, again, I'm not meaning here to put down anything in particular, but it's a way that we concretize, the way that we make things solid, the way that we hold on to things. In other words, it's a way of going astray from the true nature of reality, which is not one certain way. It's said in the teachings that each moment is completely fresh. It's never happened before, and it will never happen again. It's unique. And that all that is being overlooked when we cling to things and when we cling to beliefs. The real truth of the matter is we can use these things as stepping stones, use them as ways of communicating, use them as a way of enriching our life and enjoying things. But if we cling to it and use it as a weapon, if we find that we're threatened, should anybody disagree, then we know that somehow we're going astray, that we're blinding ourselves and weakening ourselves. The Lord of Mind is the most subtle of the three, and probably the most seductive. The Lord of Mind is how we use special states of mind to hide behind or go astray, to limit ourselves, to limit how we perceive reality. Getting high in one way or another. People use drugs this way. People use all kinds of spiritual traditions this way. People use healing this way. And it's quite prevalent, actually, now in the 90s. Special states of mind that you wish for them, you long for them, and you try to cultivate them. Many people, when they come to meditation, are quite shocked to hear what we present, because basically they want to transcend the pain of their life. And it's sort of disappointing, to say the least, to be told that you go down into the middle of it, you get right into the thick of things, and have direct contact with your experience. And if you've had a taste of these special states of mind, they are really addictive and very hard to let go of. And there's tremendous sense of vulnerability and discomfort when you start coming down or when it looks like you can't get it back. Sometimes just out of the blue, innocent people, unsuspecting people are walking along the street in the middle of a major city, and wham! They have this amazing experience. People tell me about these things all the time. A lot of people talk of out-of-body experiences that they have occasionally or on a regular basis. And people who astral travel, and there's a lot of things. And among us, we probably have these experiences or have had these experiences. So the trick is to not become attached to anything, to not try to make anything special over something else, to not grasp and cling and try to make things last or get shorter for that matter, but just let it be as it is. So this teaching on the three lords of materialism is just a very simple way of describing how we go astray from the true nature of reality and from the true nature of our being. So the question then still remains, if fear is part of growth, how do we develop this inner strength? And how do we develop trust? Trust is a very important part of the spiritual journey. Not trust in a particular outcome, but trust that you can open to the present moment. And we don't just automatically have that trust. It's something that we develop. There are many ways of talking about this. One of the ways is mindfulness. From mindfulness comes inner strength and the development of trust. Basically, the development of trust is a growing confidence that the nature of things is to change and fall apart and become something else, and you don't have to freak out about it. One of the ways that we develop this inner strength and this trust is mindfulness, and I'll talk a bit about that. And the other is the four limitless ones. This is Maitri, compassion, joy, and equanimity. It's said that these four are the causes and conditions that allow for this inner strength and this trust to grow. They are the necessary warmth that allows a flower to grow and blossom. Sometimes they're actually called the four great catalysts of awakening. They encourage growth from fear to fearlessness, from uptight to flexible. In some sense, it's all a question of developing a flexible mind, developing a flexible identity, even, you could say, that's capable of fluid transformation. I'd like to say a bit about mindfulness and about Maitri, the first of the four limitless ones. So mindfulness begins with the meditation practice. And it is, as I said at the beginning of the talk, begins with our posture with an open attentiveness to whatever arises. And it's basically a development of trust in the present moment and a willingness to contact it directly. And that present moment can be coldness or hotness, hardness or softness. That present moment can be gloom and doom, darkness, inner darkness. That present moment can be lightness. It can be sorrow. It comes in a million different forms. More than a million. Limitless, always changing. To have a completely direct experience of reality is another pseudonym for fully enlightened. And the reason I keep telling you all these definitions of fully enlightened is so that you can kind of calm down and not be in such a hurry and realize that we just go inch by inch. The main thing is a direct experience of who we are right now and beginning to trust that. Sometimes we say it's not very trustworthy because it's so addicted. But the point is that we could be mindful, openly attentive of just who we are. And an important part of mindfulness is dropping the speech balloon, which is to say, all the comments on what we observe, which generally speaking could be characterized as always dualistic, which is to say, they always are something about good or bad, right or wrong, on the track or off the track. So a lot of the process of mindfulness is beginning to relax with the present moment, touch the immediacy of our experience, our thoughts, emotions, the quality of experience as it is, and trust that. That is trustworthy. We can stay with it. Many, many of us, and maybe all of us, find it extremely difficult to just stay with the moment. And maybe all of us, to greater and lesser degrees, dissociate continually. But mindfulness is a tool for bringing us back to the actual sort of tactile taste, smell, quality, feel of the present moment, whether that's emotion or things. So for instance, when you start finding yourself suffering at the hands of the Lord of form, reaching for things, you can flip that from being crippling or something that weakens you to actually really completely contacting that experience, that taste, that touch, that smell, that feeling. Because usually what we do is we reach for these things because they help us to numb out and leave. So if we even use those things to be in full contact with what's going on, this is what you can trust. And in the process of getting used to mindfulness or being right here, you can expect shaky, tender, queasy, fearful feelings to arise. And so Maitri becomes very important. In the Shambhala teachings, they have a beautiful image, which I love very much, which is to place the fearful mind in the cradle of loving kindness. And that's the notion of Maitri, loving kindness. To place this fearful mind in the cradle of Maitri. And there's another wonderful Shambhala teaching which says that if you don't get to know the nature of fear, then you'll never know fearlessness. This is a good one to write down in your notebooks, to remember. Because we are so uncomfortable with fear, we're so uncomfortable with discomfort, that we just want to get away from it. Therefore, that's a definition of ego. It's just trying to get away from direct experience. And that's what weakens us. That what never adds up to inner strength, and it never adds up to some kind of unshakable trust. It just makes us more scared and more uptight. And saddest of all, it isolates us and cuts us off from each other. Whereas the real healing will only happen from our interconnectedness with each other, realizing our interconnectedness with each other. But this tendency to try to get away, this deep, deep desire to want to get away, cuts us off from other people and from our own emotions and thoughts. So we place this fearful mind, which is known by everybody in the species from beginningless time, we place it in the cradle of Maitri. Now I want to say about Maitri, first of all, I think it's interesting to know that Trungpa Rinpoche taught Maitri in a way which is rather unusual. He's not the only person in the world that taught it this way, but it's not the typical way of teaching Maitri. Maitri is usually taught as developing the wish for others to be happy. Therefore we have the chant, may all beings enjoy happiness and the root of happiness. And that line refers to Maitri. So usually when Maitri is taught, it's this wish for others to be happy. And this is a very important part of Maitri. But the way that Trungpa Rinpoche taught, his definition of Maitri was unlimited, unconditional friendliness towards oneself, which then naturally radiates out to others. So I'd like to describe a little bit of how this works. First of all, when we think of Maitri, usually we think of qualities like gentleness and compassion, kindness, tender-heartedness, giving ourselves a break, non-judgmental attitude. But one should realize that a very, very important part of Maitri is honesty. The journey of development of Maitri is very much away from self-deception, away from this tendency to try to avoid what's going on. And it begins with making friends with what's going on in your own mind, with your own emotions, in your own body. developing a truly unconditional friendliness towards your own mind, your own emotions, your own body. Generally speaking, when we look closely at anything, our judgments go along with it. And this is particularly true of when we look closely at ourselves. I remember very clearly when I was starting out on the path of meditation and the Buddhist teachings that I was always hearing about Maitri, and it was described as making friends with oneself. And I remember one day just raising my hand. It was like year 5 or 4.5 or something. I was about that far into it, just raising my hand and saying, I don't get it. The more I sit and get to know myself, the more I hate myself, because I see all this stuff. So it doesn't seem to me that it's adding up to friendliness. And that was sort of the beginning of me beginning to understand that part of this was seeing all of this really clearly, that clearly, to the point of actually beginning to long for it to lift, to not want anymore to harm myself in that way. So that a great longing could arise, a great yearning could arise to no longer want to be imprisoned by my own habits. But along with that, there had to be an enormous quality of compassion for oneself. And from that, I heard the teachings that we should realize that anything we see about ourselves is our introduction to realizing what other people are also feeling and thinking and seeing. To realizing the habits that every being is captured by, and beginning to have good heart towards humanity as one finds it in oneself, and then beginning to give other people a break as you start to give yourself a break. So this honesty is really important, and I think often people would like to just skip over it and just be sweet to themselves, which could easily fall into the 3 lords of materialism. In other words, in the name of Maitri, you just get real addicted to things and ideas and states of mind, because all of them make you feel so good, and that's Maitri, right? Feeling good. But actually, Maitri is just feeling whatever you feel with a compassionate attitude and with extreme honesty. As the days of your life go on, moving closer and closer to a direct experience of yourself with Maitri. I also remember asking in the early days, and many people have asked this of me and of other students who are giving teachings, and that is, why doesn't this lead to further self-absorption? Why doesn't this lead to further clinging? Why doesn't this just build ego up? Well, why doesn't it? It seems like it could. In fact, I got a letter just yesterday from someone saying, I think there can be too much Maitri. And then he said that in his Dharma study group, he saw a lot of people who were working with Maitri, and it seemed to him that they just kept never looking out, never reaching out. They just kept going round and round with their own stuff, making friends with it. But, somehow it was like a straitjacket of friendliness. And I thought that was a very good point. That ideally what this process is that to the degree that we know ourselves completely, to that degree we can relax and open outward. We don't feel the need to protect what we know. The protection always comes from wanting to protect ourselves from having to feel something, or think something, or have something happen to us. But if we know it really well already, if we know those emotions, if we know our emotions very directly and intimately, if we know our thoughts, then they cease to scare us. And they can come and they can go like clouds in the sky. Sometimes more like hurricanes in the sky, or tornadoes in the sky. But nevertheless, one can hold one's seat with mindfulness and Maitri and weather these storms. I have a very dear friend who has cyclical depressions and who has been meditating for about 20 years. And recently he was saying that when he began, he hoped that these depressions would go and he would never have them again. And somewhere into the process, he lost heart completely when he saw that, yes, things were changing for him. And yes, he felt a real softening in his being and a real opening outward. And yes, he knew that he was becoming much more flexible and had less fear. But still, every so often the depressions would come back. And that was very discouraging. And when I talked to him last, he said, now he knows that they come and he knows that they go. And when he's with them, he applies mindfulness and Maitri, and he sits with it, and it doesn't feel good. And he also knows what makes it worse, what escalates the suffering, what escalates the darkness, and he knows what helps it to lighten up. He knows that that's not a good time to make major decisions in his life. He knows it's not a good time to have important conversations with people because everything's so colored by the darkness. So he tends to use those times to read and sort of retreat and go for a lot of walks and be with himself with as much Maitri as he can. And then it was very interesting. I don't know how many of you read this article by Trungpa Rinpoche that was in the Shambhala Sun about 3 issues ago. But it was very interesting. There was a whole part in it about depression. I think the article was called The Lion's Roar. And there was a man in the questions and answers that started to ask Rinpoche about depression. And Rinpoche described it so vividly, what depression felt like, that you knew that he knew what it was to be depressed. He described it as everything closing in and the ceiling sort of coming down and there being nowhere to breathe or move, and that everything you did to try to get rid of it just made it worse. And then he kept saying to the man, or whoever the questioner was, he kept saying, it's so juicy. It has so much energy in it. It's one of the best. It's really powerful. It's a wonderful one to contact directly. You should really get into it. And the person was just saying, are you kidding? But it was somewhat convincing because it was clear that Rinpoche himself had worked with it that way. This question of developing inner strength, it's really important. And this question of the development of strength and trust is really important. But we should know that if we look for the strength and the trust in the wrong places, it never adds up. We just become weaker and more afraid. And so this path of opening to experience, it's a gradual path. Part of Maitri means that you aren't in a rush, that you really trust your own speed. If you go too fast, there's backlash. And if there's too much backlash, you give up altogether. You get completely discouraged and you just don't come back. You roll up your mat and go away. So gentleness is really important in terms of letting things evolve at their own speed. And I've come to realize that this is also the best instruction for Maitri and mindfulness. With your own experience, with your own being, just watch how you evolve and then make your moves according to how it's happening, rather than you have these ideals and concepts that you're trying to measure up to. So when you experience fear, realize that it is part of life and it's definitely part of growth. And it's definitely part of shedding very old, crippling patterns. but these patterns, we're addicted to them. So there's going to be a real process that goes on. So one should place that fearful mind in the cradle of loving kindness and work with mindfulness and Maitri. I'd like to introduce the bodhicitta practice of Maitri and Karuna, the actual formal practice of arousing the feeling of Maitri, then letting that radiate out. And in keeping with the three noble principles, I would very sincerely like to make the aspiration that this benefits all of us. And in particular, that something begins to transform in us, and that transformation leads us from suffering to happiness, and at the most profound level of really beginning to, as a result of this practice, get the notion of what is the root of happiness, what causes it to expand and flower, what causes it to grow rather than to decrease. And beginning to get the actual sense in our everyday life at a non-conceptual level, just at the level of our being, of what is it that causes suffering, what is the root of suffering, so that we might be able to speak and act and think, live our lives in a way where suffering for ourselves and others begins to de-escalate, where there's less suffering. I think it's important to realize that we don't evolve alone. These qualities in us, they don't happen in isolation. They happen in relationship to other people. It's compassion for ourselves and others that causes the compassion to increase and the suffering to decrease. It doesn't happen in isolation. And in that regard, I think it's quite inspiring to realize that if one person can connect with what is the root of happiness and the root of suffering and begin to live their life that way, if one person can connect with this spark of bodhicitta so that it grows, and this capacity to open our minds beyond narrow-mindedness and closed, painfully self-centered views, if even one person can do that, to the degree that one person can do that, it makes it easier for the rest of us. So we evolve together to the degree that some people are beginning to get the hang of this. You can count on the fact that many other people all over the globe are beginning to get the hang of this. I've noticed this over the years with my spiritual practice in the community, that I would have insights in my meditation, very personal, true, transformative insights, genuine, non-conceptual insights, only to find in my discussions with my friends that they were having the same insights. And then to start reading, magazine articles and books and things and see that other people were having the same insights. So it works like that. So don't think that your meager attempt to feel love and to feel compassion is wasted, to the degree that you even aspire to awaken your good heart, your kind heart, to love and care for others, to be able to have the bravery actually to feel the pain of other people, to overcome the fear of feeling the pain that exists in this world. Even your aspiration to do that, your wanting to do that, it has enormous power for the whole human consciousness to evolve. Not just you, not just us in this room, not just people who practice Buddhist meditation, but the whole species. And we could aspire that it also helps the ants and the bees, the fish and the tarantulas and the monkeys and parrots and everybody. And all those beings that we are told exist that we don't even perceive them. That everybody can benefit from this meager, humble beginning of us starting to do this practice. I would also say that it's probably going to be a lot easier for us than maybe it would have been 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, because of the fact that people have been doing it. And people have been gaining insight from it over the years. And therefore we step into a pool of energy which is already here. We are going to do this Maitri practice, the wish that all beings enjoy happiness and the root of happiness. It's basically just arousing the wish that this could be so, that we could be happy and that others could be happy. Before I present the practice, I'd like to say that what makes this friendliness, this love, this Maitri, limitless, has to do with us beginning to get the hang of what is the root cause. What is it that causes happiness and suffering? What is it that would allow for happiness to expand and for suffering to decrease? Traditionally, what is said is that the root of suffering is ignorance, and that the root of happiness is the dissolving of ignorance. And if you ask, well, what are we ignorant of? Ignorant of the true nature of reality. So entrenched in a static way of thinking and perceiving reality. So entrenched in seeing ourselves and others as objects that are sort of pitted against each other. Sense of isolation, sense of solidness of things, static. And that the true nature is of limitlessness, in process, fluid, not solid. And most importantly, that we are all part of a flow of energy, of process, part of the whole. We're not actually isolated. Just as I described how our little effort here actually will cause it to be easier for other people. It's all like that. Everything we do is either causing the whole species, all of us, the whole everything, to open more, or we stay in the same holding patterns, if you know what I mean. We stay sort of continually hooked in the same way. So you could say the whole Buddhist teaching is a contemplation, a study, a meditating upon, trying to get to a real living experience of knowing what causes suffering and what causes happiness, to really understand what that ignorance is, not just conceptually, but truly understand it. But it has a lot to do with relaxing our mind, and it has a lot to do with opening our heart. And it is said that these four limitless ones, Maitri and compassion, joy and equanimity, are catalysts for speeding up this process of having the insight dawn on what causes suffering and what causes happiness. The important thing, I think, is that perhaps your insight will grow even more than it is now into the fact that how we usually proceed is like heaping suffering on top of suffering. Because we feel pain, we just seek for pleasure in the wrong places. Because we feel constricted, we look in the wrong places. We're always trying to basically get away from the discomfort. And therefore, it just makes matters worse. We are actually a whole species who have spent centuries, centuries and centuries of getting really good at making matters worse. On the other hand, this is definitely a time in history where there's a real movement towards making matters better, a real movement, global movement towards less denseness and more openness, less holding and more opening. On the other hand, it's going the other way too. Both things are happening. So I could probably give, 25 talks on the root of suffering and the root of happiness, and it might not still be part of your living experience. And so a very important point is to continue to contemplate this and just to notice. You can read what the teachings have to say on it, but actually notice in your own experience what words make things better and what words make things worse. in terms of suffering. What actions make things worse and what actions make things better. This has enormous power. Just beginning to see our ability to turn that around comes from being able to see how certain things actually make the pain increase and other things cause us to lighten up and open.